Hello, everyone. My name is Gail Low, and welcome to the launch of Kirsty Gunn's new collection of short stories, Pretty Ugly. Now, Kirsty was born in New Zealand, educated at Victoria University in Wellington, and also at Oxford, I should say. Kirsty is an award-winning novelist, a short story writer, an essayist, a critic, with 12 single-authored books to her name, in addition to editing and co-editing anthologies of writing. Now, one of the most exciting things about your writing, Kirsty, is your intellectual curiosity and the sustained commitment to the writing life, as well as, I think, your protean ability to move between forms. So your novels and your short stories and your essays might sound a lyrical note and could sometimes be considered prose poetry in cadence and rhythm. And your intellectual curiosity about genres takes you across a variety of forms. So I think of the big music and the pibroch as a way that you engage with the pibroch music. I think of Caroline's Bikini, where you engage with Petrarchan sonnets. And I think of The Boy in the Sea, where you write with the sea in mind as kind of metaphor, as a rhythm of undulations. And also the darkness of that early novel that you have, The Keepsake, where you engage with the Gothic and the darkness of the Gothic. Now, all of this, I think, is handled really lightly with an airy lightness. Touch and cadence writing. And I'm thinking of you as a kind of modern day Ariel of sorts. Now, Kirsty is a Royal Literary Fellow at Merton College, as well as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and a Royal Society of Literature Fellow too. So we're here today to hear her read from her new collection of short stories, just out, published by Rough Trade Press, which, to quote from her foreword to the collection, deliberately mixes the terrible, the ugly, the beautiful with the beautiful. All that can be, if you like, a form, all of that can be a form of nourishment, something that will give life. So welcome, Kirsty, to the table.
Thank you so much, Gail, for that lovely, generous and intelligent and thoughtful reading kind of introduction. What a wonderful reader you are, and how the writer wishes that all readers would have this lovely sense that you do of roaming around inside a text and thinking about what it's doing to our brains and to our sense of memory, to our sense of understanding and thinking about what a story is, and then, of course, in turn, thinking about our own lives and the narrative of being. I just love the way you touched on all kinds of things that, yes, I am really interested in as a writer, and we can talk about that in this next delicious hour that we have together. Thank you too for mentioning. I'm going to be reading from my beautiful new collection of stories, Pretty Ugly. Look how beautiful this book is. I'm just kind of in love with its appearance, and it's more than pretty cover. This cover that in itself captures something of the texture of these stories within. Pretty Ugly, the divine and the dreadful, all mixed up together. I'm going to start our discussion by reading from the opening pages of the first story in the collection, which is a story called Blood Knowledge. There was something wrong with the garden. You couldn't see it, nothing was obvious. There were no strange plants organized in certain shapes or sinister-looking growths and weeds. The paths were orderly, and the lawns. Roses grew and pinks in the places that had been set out for them, and in autumn, berries came out on the crabapple trees along the west side of the wall beside the vegetable plot. It was lovely, actually. Even so, something was not right, and never had been. Venetia, the beautiful Venice, her husband Richard called her, might have pointed with a long white finger to the stunted pines that clung together by the gate and boundary, those stiff black branches that would wave wildly in a storm. She could have used them by way of example. But they were nothing out of the ordinary either. Douglas firs were good for a garden, Richard said. They massed and gave protection. Half the reason they could grow the things they did, he told her, was because of those strong trees that you could see from her study window, like sentinels, is how Richard described them. He loved it, the garden. It is everything to me, he joked. More than the house, even. Not more than me, though, surely. Venetia, the beautiful Venice, his city of palazzos and canals, would say to him in turn. And silly, would be his unchanging reply. So forget about a place of odd or frightening plants with thorns or savage leaves and stalks. Richard had made it a haven, the 3/4 of an acre that surrounded their home, and a haven it had been when they'd first moved here, all those years ago before the children were born. He used the word haven then, because after the stresses of his city job, there it was, the garden, a safe place for the two of them, with everything growing and flourishing as it should. And they still talked about it that way, didn't they? That the garden, like everything in their life, would be as they would want it. It was a conversation between the two of them that had factored a sort of faith in the decisions that they'd made together, a belief. Only the reality was, Venetia knew, that the wife who each day applied fresh makeup to her face, drawing on before the mirror a fine dark pink or crimson lipstick mouth, also knew the very earth from which the garden was made held something secretive and so peculiar that it could spoil everything, and that it was there, that knowledge, and that the garden had the capacity to keep it, no matter what she and Richard said, long after their deaths, forever actually. It was bedded in. She never spoke about any of this out loud, of course. Instead, she went out in the mornings with her cup of coffee, her favourite cup, the one with the golden rim, and looked across the lawns, admiring the hedge by the gate with its uniform shape, the fuchsia and honeysuckle that had been planted to look wild in the far corner. It had been such a long time now since they'd moved here and fashioned the garden to be the way it was, so why not, irrespective of her feelings, admire it? After all, nothing had changed. The family had all been well, there'd been no concerns or disappointments. She and Richard were in good health, and he'd made so much money in that job of his, they couldn't help but feel contented. The 4 children, grown up with families and careers of their own by now, but coming home all the time for lovely holidays and visits. There was Emma, who they'd always called Baby, with a baby of her own now, living in the next village, and Tom and Susanna and Evan, busy in London as ever. It's true, Venetia, the lovely Venetia thought, as she arranged one of her pale blue or rose or emerald-coloured shawls about her shoulders before sitting down to her desk every day to work, that she'd had nothing to trouble her through this long period of marriage and family, of domestic life. In fact, you might say, and she did, she reminded herself of this often, and more now that she was older, putting on her lipstick in the morning, checking before the mirror that the colour was right. She had had everything for herself that she might have expected. You could use this phrase if you like, a perfect life. In fact, silly, Richard would say again, if she was to bring up the subject of doing things differently, as she used to do sometimes in the early years, talking then about moving away maybe, or going to live abroad for a time, as though they may take a break from what they were building up around them, or even escape it altogether. For silly it must have been to think that he would leave the position he'd attained in the firm, one of the most prestigious in London, or that she herself would give up the writing commissions that by then were already creating a lifestyle for her, of working to contract, one novel every couple of years, like clockwork, like a machine. Even so, she would talk sometimes back then when the children were young, and later too, about how they might live somewhere else, be different, as she used to describe it, as though she already knew about it, that other life. But why would you have such a silly idea? Was always Richard's response. Be somewhere different, as though we were different people, when we have everything as we need it here, everything. Because, she might begin, his beautiful Venice, each of her lovely shawls a gift from him, and a new colour chosen for every passing year, because, and shh, he would reply, drawing her to him, taking in his hands her long white fingers, caressing her rings and gems. My city of palazzos and canals, he would murmur. Shh, now, silly. For this reason, Richard's sweet shh, his love of quietness and the daily routine of life, the various requirements of work and domesticity that increased over time. It had been many years since she had talked about where they lived, suggesting that they might find another way of feeling at home. And it was hardly the time now. Was Richard about to retire for good in a year's time to start bringing up those sorts of thoughts again, find ways of introducing them into a conversation? So why was she doing that just recently, interrupting herself and him? Why be starting to imagine at this late point in their lives change? For it was measured out, surely it was, their remaining future fixed, with Richard already planning certain activities in advance of all the extra time he'd soon have to spend. A greenhouse, that was the next idea, built in the Edwardian style and great for parties, he said. Lots and lots of parties, and that they'd be able to sit out there as well, just the two of them, even in the winter months if they wanted. Amongst all what? Orange trees and tropical flowers? Anything. He'd already spoken to architects and was laying out a ground. Look, darling, 3 weeks ago he'd started digging the back lawn. They'd be able to see from the large imagined glassed-in room, he said, all the tiny geraniums he'd grown from seed, pale pink and lemon and soft, baby blue they were pictured on their packet, and that he'd been tending on the windowsill of his potting shed through the winter and early spring, promising her that phrase she hated, a show, a real show. Dear Richard, despite his awful job, digging away, preparing for something he called a show. How he knew nothing about it, fiddling with his little seeds. In so many ways, he was like a young boy, a child, as though he'd never been the kind of lawyer he had turned into, while all the time throughout their marriage, she had been fully grown. And here they were now, Venetia supposed, the pair of them old, with a massive payout on the way, pensions, benefits. Yes, old. Though hard to believe, she found herself saying to friends, speaking in the kinds of cliches that people expected, using that easy vocabulary of a certain kind of life. Hard to believe when the years had rushed by so quickly, one book after another, and there was nothing much to worry about there either, never had been. From the first title, all that time ago when they were just married, she had been writing the series that her publishers adored. A global trend is how they described it. It had just gone on and on. No need to stop now, sweetheart, her editor had joked with her in his last call. The Japanese translation's about to come out over there, and that's the beginning of a whole new market for you if you want it. Want it? She had replied and laughed. She had an airy, tinkling laugh her friends loved. I don't seem to have much choice. She was looking down at her hands, splayed on the fine walnut surface of her desk, her editor on the speakerphone saying something about marketing budgets. Her hands were so white, even after all these years, she'd looked after them. What sells is what's wanted, she said. I know that by now. She flexed her long fingers, admiring them still, and all her rings. But don't worry, she'd finished. I've already had some ideas that would work well in the Far East. I started on something, in fact. Good for you, Richard said when she told him, as he did every time, about another sale, a new contract. It was the way her life was. A story here, then the next, and the next. Everything in order, and one novel every 2 years like clockwork, remember? Hadn't she written that down somewhere? No need to stop now, like a refrain, like a machine. Beautiful Venice, my city of palazzos and canals. When she stood in front of the mirror sometimes, after applying her lipstick in the morning or when removing makeup at night, she might open her mouth so wide she could see right inside herself, into her own dark workings. That was who she really was. and the garden would keep its secret. The children had grown up enclosed by its walls and flowers. What were they to imagine anything different, that a place may have another shrunken life within, a sort of shadow, was it, another self? But that's how it felt to her, stepping in the gate whenever she'd been away, whatever time of day or night or season, back then or now. The feeling that she'd returned to a somewhere else that was a separate story, a place with its plots, its hidden corners, that was also home. My beautiful Venice. She might think about the garden story, but need never say.
Firstly, that's such a powerful story to open the collection with, holding, if you like, that idea of what would be a kind of perfect middle class domesticity, a lovely life where there was no want really, and then that darker secret life, the secret lives of women, and holding both at the same time. What possessed you to write something like this? And you have to tell the audience what that secret might be, because it comes as a real shock when I first read it.
I'm not going to tell anybody what the secrets are in these stories, because I'd love everybody to read them for themselves. But gosh, Gail, you're absolutely right. And a number of people who've said to me about not only that story, but a whole number of stories in this collection, Kirsty, where did that come from? And, that's been making me reflect, Gail, on the fact that we seem to live in a world whereby, what has happened to the imagination? Why is it that there seems to have been a closing of the gap between the writer as an artist and someone who makes things up and someone who rattles around in the places of the imagination and makes things from it? Why is it that that gap that used to exist between that maker and the piece of work has now been closed over by something called, I don't know, real life, biography, an interest in the personal? But it seems that increasingly people seem unable to talk about literature without talking about the person who wrote it, as though there may be some kind of link. Oh, the kind of person who wrote that kind of story must be this kind of person, and so on. In fact, some people now even talk about the narrator in a story or other as though it may indeed even be the writer. I mean, how many times when I've been giving readings and so on of a story that might be written in the first person, I've done this, I did that, I think this, will people come up to me afterwards and say, that's so terrible that you went through that, or what a wonderful thing to have experienced that. I don't quite know why this has happened. It never used to be the case that when people picked up a story, they thought, well, there's the story of the writer's life somehow embedded. Is it too much Freud? I don't know. All I know is that the imagination gives up wonderful stories and secrets and images and ideas that we can play with and learn from and enjoy.
And challenge. I mean, it seems to me the challenge is, it's frightening in the story, because we have an investment in the lovely lives that we live, and we like things just so. We like things ordered, as you described, the garden that is done in a certain kind of way. Yet there's something else that's so rivetingly powerful about authoring your own, narrating your own life in this secret manner, of having a secret other world, as much as this other world is real to the woman who is described in the story.
Certainly, that is Venetia's story. As you say, there's a story that's going on two levels, because there's this outward show. I mean, it's a word she hates. You're going to find out later in the story perhaps why she hates that word so much, for its connotations. But yes, there's this outward show of a life which on the surface all seems well upholstered and plump and fat with the pickings of late capitalism. And she's doing jolly well, as a writer, churning out these books for a market that endlessly devours versions of the same. The books have a series called, the books are part of a series called Home is Where, and she writes them in a sequence. So it might be, Home is Where, and it might be set in in a Scottish castle in the 18th century, or home is where a Caribbean island during the time of slave plantations, or home is where a poor down at heel servant girl comes to work in Chelsea. I mean, whatever. This is the kind of stuff that this woman writes, this endless drip, and it does jolly well, and it's all part of, you know, providing this beautiful lifestyle for her. And yet all the time, and we learn this as we come into the story, and in fact we start to become part of Venetia's project, all the time Venetia is making another kind of artwork, secretive, dark, and a project to which she's paid utmost care and attention pretty much all through her adult life. So that thing of like two levels is fascinating and wonderful stuff to play with. And again, creates that tension that you talked about.
Yeah, it's lovely. I mean, that phrase is so chilling, that they might find another way of feeling at home. And then also when you say, when she's looking herself in the mirror in the morning, removing her makeup at night, she might open her mouth so wide she could see right inside herself into her own dark workings. That was just such a chilling phrase, you know, and all of a sudden, I know you start with a wrinkle, there was something not quite right, you know, which then lets us kind of expect something's going to happen, and then you create, I mean, you never really give us completely why she is the way she is, why she decides that this is her act of self-creation almost. We never really understand the psychology of that act of self-creation, but we see the effects of it, and it's so bloody powerful.
Yeah, I think that's so true, Gail. And this whole thing of like, why should we expect to understand motivation? You know, there's so much talk that goes on around novels and short stories as though they're there, you know, to explain themselves to the reader. And I've always loved that. I'm always quoting that line from Muriel Spark. You know, people shouldn't expect their novels to do their thinking for them. You know, it's a wonderful thing to go into a story and to be puzzled and to have to figure things out. And best of all, you know, to feel challenged and to keep thinking about the story afterwards, because what that means is that the story is becoming knit into your own life. And at that point, you know, one's had a kind of an adjustment, and one thinks about the world differently, and one lives a little bit differently. How very interesting that kind of experience of reading, set next to, you know, what I might call the lying in the dark, being spoon-fed explanation and a kind of an easy unraveling of plot. Because after all, this other business of, you know, tying up ends and making everything smoothly made up towards a conclusion. Of course, this is nothing like life. Our lives are chaotic and random and full of event and experience and a whole flood of emotions that all come at once or in short succession. And yet there's a persistence about fiction somehow smoothing all of this into a shape and then tying it all up with a bow at the end and presenting it with its meaning. And I mean, really, what kind of reading experience is that? It's as though it's been created for babies. And in fact, you know, some of the children's literature that I read as a child is far more exciting than that kind of other thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really powerful and gripping because we still don't know, and we have all sorts of reasons. And because you can't narrate it as a reader, I mean, I always think of narrative as a way of also making safe something, kind of coming to some kind of resolution of it. And because we don't know and we can't know, it just is much more powerful. I mean, it stays in your mind, it knits itself, as you say, into one's unconscious of sorts. And it just kind of grows in a slightly ugly but fascinating way.
It's something to do, Gail, I think, with like allowing gaps in a reading experience and not, you know, filling everything up. I love what the writer and critic Gabriel Josipovici says when he's talking about, you know, so much fiction, so much contemporary literature. He says, this is his phrase, so many shoes, so many handbags. He's using that phrase as a way of talking about the fact that, you know, narrative is stuffed with information that's going to kind of make it seem real on the page, and is going to fill up the reader's mind with all of the kind of bricolage of the experience of the story, so that the reader doesn't have any room to move or turn, let alone ask a question. Every crevice, every crack, every cranny has been filled with detail and explanation. But my goodness, to leave gaps means that the reader can then come in and roam around in those gaps and then become part of the story. So instead of the story being out there and something that, again, people talk about this all the time now, and it kind of makes my hair stand on end. They talk about consuming literature, you know, instead of consuming your short story like you might consume a fast food hamburger. Instead, there's this lovely experience of being open to the gaps and the uncertainties, and you start to then make the story up yourself. You become part of the story, the writing of it, the reading of it becomes part of the writing of it. I know that sounds a bit vague and funny, but it really is an experience. It's a bit like if you're listening to someone, listening to something really riveting, whether it's a song sequence or someone playing an instrument or someone telling about something. You'll see everybody lean forward to try and understand and have the fullness of the thing. But the leaning forward is an expression of the fact that there's a gap there, and that the reader feels a need to come forward and to you know, move towards it, as opposed to, as I say, this kind of placid, flaccid, passive sense of just being in receipt of everything you might need.
But this is a story of domesticity or willful desire to destroy that kind of show of domesticity, and that's of course a very gender a gender thing, if you like. In your story, you talk about Richard, the husband, talking about his wife as my Venetia, my Venice, and he essentially wants to kind of smash that version of herself that's kind of put on show. Could we have another short extract from something else that again talks about that secret life of women, that's these powerful kind of urges and powerful drives underneath, if you like, that kind of easy, homely sense of domesticity?
Sure. I can read from a story in the collection that comes later on called Mam's Tables. And unlike the other story, which I started from the beginning, I'm going to plunge into this one. So let me just explain that this is the story presented as an account by a narrator who's been brought up in foster homes. So we come into the story where she's reflecting on that experience in her life, and she's remembering one particular foster mother who goes by the name of Mam, and this is what she says. So yes, it was an easy setup. That's the household that the children were all enjoying. So yes, it was an easy setup, and Mam was easy with us. Is all there should have been to it, the way she made it seem as though we really were in a gang together, that we were her special crew. It was a pretty good way for a kid to live. She was generous about things, getting wrecked, and taught us about gardening, flowers. She had loads of cats. You could stay in the bath as long as you wanted, keep the bedside light on through the night if you needed it, and there were books, all kinds, and she never said, oh, this one, or no, not that one. You could just read whatever, or watch telly. She didn't mind about the stuff of rules, behavior, and she was a great cook, always talking with us about what she was making and what we were going to have, roasts and chips and pies and all kinds of puddings. She was easy with us that way as well, never making us eat what we didn't like, only her own recipes, everything we wanted on our plate. That house of hers was mainly kitchen. Upstairs were bedrooms, the bathrooms, but her own room on the ground floor had once been a sitting room, maybe. So the whole place was set up as though it was for all of us, as though Mam had made it that way, as though she really had. And to be in that big old kitchen of hers, with its bookshelves and the cooker that had a fire in it, sitting around all of us at this one enormous table, it felt safe, it did. Her, come here, you, and our answer, get off, but knowing she would gather us in even so, to be there at the table with her, to be close. We'd be hanging around, always hungry, wanting this and that, and Mam might be over there at the bench cutting something up or mixing ingredients in a bowl, plums on the stove or sugar, carrots, some kinds of preserves, whatever. She might be looking out the window, talking back to us, the radio on. That room was where everything happened. And the table, that table of Mam's in the middle of it all, it was like a raft. It was like living your life there. At tea time, we'd all be sitting down together at that table, and there was room enough. You could always move over and let someone else in. It seemed some kids were always there. One boy, much older than me, was forever drawing pictures of buildings, the insides of them, churches. His papers were all piled up at one end, and we didn't have to clear them away. The girls over on the other side of him would be painting their nails or going through magazines. I like her. No, I don't like her. They'd be talking or not talking, homework, doing that, or not being able. You could do whatever you wanted. There was this girl I quite liked who wrote tiny poems on pieces of cardboard and made them into little boxes, and she'd be there, colouring and gluing, writing away. Mam didn't make anyone stop, whatever it was they were up to when it was time to eat, but we all did stop, because she sat down then, and we really were like her family gathered around, her saying to us, okay, here we all are, me old shakies, and isn't this nice? Like saying grace, kind of, like my in-laws do, only not the same, because I trusted the table. Even now, I find myself thinking about it, though I know I can't trust it, and that none of this is really a sure memory of anything that went on for me back then when I was a kid. Still, it was nice, like Mam said it was, to be there, sitting there. I thought so. Everyone came and went at that house. We kids came and went. And though I never really developed the habit, you might say, of intimacy, that old woman seemed to have made something that would hold us and that it would last. Her saying, let's have a good look at you, eh? In the midst of all the coming and going, and getting you up on her knee for a chat. I can remember exactly the feel of the big arms, the bony leg under the cotton dress, winter or summer, the man's cardigan she wore if it was cold, and me sitting up there against its dark wool, making things seem so, nice. It was another of those words of hers in that phrase, isn't this nice? She'd be speaking as though to herself. What are we going to do with you, eh? Saying, you old shaky quake. And she would put her fingers through my long hair and draw patterns into it, braiding, and with a soft brush, making a style even. You got to calm down and relax or what? She'd say to me. There's nothing to worry about, nothing at all. No wonder, stupid. I thought I was part of her gang. We all did. I was allowed to wear trousers and have my shirt off all through the summer, and Mam would still call me pretty. You're a special girl, Shirley, she used to say. Don't let anyone talk you out of it. But talk does talk, and that means it shifts and it changes. Mam's own words did. Bang, remember? A heart put out. Well, that's what happened there, all right. Because for sure, and I know it, I have it in my history, those same sentences of Mam's that let me in and held me close were also how everything got mucked up for me there at that house. And I'll never tell Donna, I won't, about how that changed things for me. I couldn't describe it, how even though back then I might have liked to have thought otherwise, that there was a steady platform, a good floor to stand a table on, I know a great hole is there in that kitchen, in Mam's old red lino. It's like a bulldozer's come in. So there might have been all that braiding and that you're special nothing. You need to be able to hold on to what people say if their words are going to be of any use to you and be something real. Descriptions of a life have to stay the same, see? or else they fall away. And I don't have the first clue, me, about who I am, who I might be, though I've tried to fix things, and some might say I do, making it up so nice with Donna and the kids and a job and all the rest of it. Still, I've learned not to trust words to have too much about truth in them. And I won't tell Donna, I won't, that just when I think I'm getting over any kind of remembering, the past jumps out and I'm back in Mam's kitchen again, falling straight through the floor of that same red lino into the dark.
Oh, that's gorgeous, Kirsty. Again, that sense of the easeful life, the intimacy, and the domesticity of that scene where everyone is in it together, and then the dark, the great big hole that one could fall through. And you have thematically those kinds of things held up in the same way again. The thing I wanted to ask you about, which I've only kind of hearing you read it, kind of it struck me. This whole idea of as though Mam had made it that way, as though she really had, and then you say something else later on, that that old woman seemed to have made something that would hold us and that it would last. And then you talk in that final paragraph of your reading. You need to be able to hold on to what people say if their words are going to be of any use to you and be something real. But I maybe press you on this idea of creating creating a reality through words, if you like, which you seem to be hinting at here, even though that reality may not entirely be the one that one departs with.
Thanks so much for asking that question, Gail, because it's absolutely key to my writing practice and to the kinds of things I'm interested in when I sit down to make any kind of text. This issue of what's real or not never occurs to the poet. The poet is creating something on the page that is the thing. A cry of its own occasion is the lovely phrase Wallace Stevens has about it. It's just a thing, it's there, it has its own life. Now, yes, it might have a connection to a thing that's gone on, and the poem might sometimes be explicit about that. But generally, the poem is the thing. Well, in the same way, I'm interested in creating stories, fiction, that feels absolutely truthful and real, that the experience of reading it sentence by sentence is the level at which a kind of factuality occurs. And the factuality is the fact of language itself. So that the sentences are never there as containers to hold, to hold the content of a story, or to say, or to feel that they have to justify or defend themselves against reality, or be mimetic in some kind of way. I'm going to set a story in New York City, therefore I have to make sure that I get that right street on Fifth Avenue, and what is that shop on the corner, and so on. None of these things are of interest to me at all, but what's of interest is to create that story set in New York City that makes the reader feel, as they're reading it, that New York City is being built around them word by word. So to this extent, for this kind of project, black becomes white and truth becomes lie. The certainty is how we're feeling as we're immersed in the sentence by sentence experience of the thing. And again, is this not like life itself? That those things that are said, perhaps out of context or perhaps regretted afterwards, nevertheless remain the sentences that ring around in the echo chambers of our minds and continue to affect us. That language is real, and the stuff we say and the stuff we read, it's, to my mind, as real as the ground under our feet or the grass outside the front door.
It's funny because when I've read some of these stories, and all through your collection as well, and all through your novels, there is a foregrounding of the act of telling the story, if you like. I mean, I sometimes think of at the start of it, I used to think, well, aren't these the kind of metafictional aspects of writing? And then I've come to a decision that maybe it's not metafiction, because metafiction, you start off with the immersive world of the story, and then you pull the rug from underneath the feet of your reader, and you tell the reader that this is writing about writing. But your stories always foreground the act of writing as creating the world that actually unfolds before you, which is kind of a completely reverse way of thinking about that hierarchy between words and reality.
Totally. And I've written like that for as long as I can remember, and it's there in my first book, and it's there in this collection of stories. It's there throughout my life, that you're engaged in something. You're engaged in a world, the world of the book, the world of the people who are living in that book, and the stories that are the things that are happening to them. All of this stuff is the experience that the reader is having. But yes, all the time, it's an experience that's being made, it's being forged on the page by someone who's putting it all together. I love that thing that Virginia Woolf says, who is telling this story? That we begin a story with that very question. Stories just don't arrive out of the blue as though by magic. I mean, there's a certain kind of person who will talk about being lost in a book. To my mind, that kind of total immersion feels like being asleep. I like the idea of being awake in my own dream and roaming around and asking questions of it. So yeah, that feeling that the whole thing has been made up word by word, and that is part of the experience of the story itself, is very kind of really exciting to me. And again, is doing really interesting things in terms of how it makes us think about the reality that we perceive around us, and the role of the imagination in things that are happening minute by minute, whether we're going up the road to buy some milk or patting our dog. That all the time, that imaginative experience is running through. Gail and I have just had a really lovely morning as part of this wonderful festival this morning, talking with a whole bunch of writers in a workshop we put together about what we're calling palimpsestual thinking and writing. And this is something that Gail and I have been starting to investigate and explore in our own teaching practice, and in teaching essaying in particular. But we've been talking with the students and the writers about this kind of way of writing. You may start with a one layer of experience, and then on top of that, you build the next layer, and then the next and the next. And from this, you're kind of building something up, very real, from the ground up, as it were. And based on that idea that a palimpsest is a kind of manuscript or text where we can see through the words that were written there beforehand and before that. So I think in a way that kind of palimpsest-like thinking is part of the making of fiction too. That in a way the reader can have the fun of seeing your workings. Remember that lovely expression when we were all children sitting exams and the exam paper says, show your workings.
You get credit. I never came to the conclusion on my maths exam, but I got credit for showing my workings, even if they led me to the wrong conclusion.
Exactly. I love that. That there's no conclusion, but you've shown your workings, so you're going to get some points. Lovely.
But so let me ask you then, how do you shape a collection of short stories together? I mean, you were talking about building it from bit by bit and actually then kind of coming to a whole world of sorts in the book. How do you choose to follow one story? I mean, what is it about this collection that actually kind of the rhythm of it that goes from story to story that sets up, if you like, some of the things that you are obviously investigating, exploring?
Gosh, Gail, another fabulous question from you. I mean, here's what happens for me, and I guess for everybody it's different. I'm always writing short stories because I just love them. There's just nothing about short stories I don't love. It's the opportunity they give us to go into this place, this imagined world, and totally live there, and to feel altered by it, and then to come out. To me, this experience is a bit like, going into a really exciting room and spending time there. and then you come away from it and you've been, everything's been adjusted by your being in there. So the world of short stories is just the most fantastic one for me. And in fact, even when I'm writing long, novels, in a way, they're kind of made by making lots of short stories that all kind of come together. That's a separate question. But with this collection, so what happens is I'm always writing short stories. And there are some stories in this collection that were written and then they were being published in, magazines or whatever. And then I wrote that story, Blood Knowledge, that you asked me to read from at the beginning. And when I had that story, something about it then made me think, oh, actually, this is kind of taking me to a certain place. I've written another story just before it, which had similar qualities of just this kind of very highly aestheticized world being matched with something that was very dangerous and antisocial and unpleasant. And I thought, right, something's kind of going on here. And at that point, I started to think, yes, I can imagine this being a collection. So I kept writing, but the business of making the collection, which is now pretty ugly, was a case of then sitting down and figuring out what stories were going to go in and what weren't. So it's not as though every single story I've been writing, since my last novel was called Caroline's Bikini, and it came out in I'm terrible at dates, actually. I've just promptly forgotten, but quite a while ago now. So after I finished Caroline's Bikini, I was just writing short stories all the time. But yeah, it was when I realized that Blood Knowledge was giving me some kind of little bit of a signpost that I then started to cluster and arrange. So there are stories that aren't in the collection simply because they didn't entirely fit. There are also stories in the collection that are very different from the stories I've just read and shared with you. I mean, I love what the writer Adam Mars-Jones has written in the inside flap. He talks about me shuffling the cards. I love that image. It's just like, oh, you thought it was going to be all like that? Oh no, it's also this. You thought it was hearts? No, here's the Jack of Diamonds. So it's not like I have a theme or anything like that, but there were simply some stories that didn't belong in this kind of reading experience that I wanted the reader to have with Pretty Ugly.
So it's an organic process of working performatively with the reading of the stories.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I do so much work aloud anyway. Like when I'm writing, I'm always reading aloud. So, and also I'm always kind of imagining the project in hand as being something other than a bunch of pages with type on them. I'm always imagining them as another thing, like the last novel, Caroline's Bikini. I kind of imagined that as a little whirring golden machine that had all of this kind of internal logic and a certain kind of, it was like a beautiful little kind of Renaissance clickety clicking clock made of gold. And the big music that you mentioned before in your introduction, the novel that's based around Pibroch music and that's set in the Highlands, I saw this as a kind of, almost like an installation where there were lots of files, manila files with material and information inside each one. So in this collection, Pretty Ugly, I just saw a bunch of like super exquisite things, like really like impossibly kind of gorgeous, while also being a lot of them really, really awful. I mean, there's one story, I think it comes straight after Blood Knowledge, which is just like so busy, like it's full of roses and champagne. But it also has old Joan Collins sitting in the midst of it, funny old Joan Collins. What's she doing in the midst of this beautiful Mayfair drawing room with its, Tattinger champagne and beautiful bouquets of roses? So like I just have this kind of thing of like the whole thing being this kind of exquisitely made set of items that you go through one by one, almost like opening the kind of most gorgeous kind of advent calendar. And what's behind each door? Oh my goodness, it's that.
Yeah.
Or opening the most fantastically wrapped you know, chocolate, and then you take a bite of it and it's kind of like, oh,
oh my goodness. Okay, I'm aware that we're running out of time, and I wanted you to read one more short story to send us on our way, if you like, because I've so enjoyed the reading of this particular collection.
Gail, thank you so much. It's always such a pleasure talking with you. And I think since we had such a lovely, lovely session this morning with the students, and after I finish this, let's just quickly talk to the screen about imagined spaces.
Really.
Quickly, so that people can stay in touch with us after this event. So anyhow, we used a story from this collection as part of to begin our writing exercise this morning. So those of us who have joined us now for this part, you'll remember that we took our protagonist. He'd arrived back in this beloved place, this beloved landscape that had meant so much to him when he'd been a boy, that he'd come to this place for holidays, and it had been, you know, a very, very special place. And he's now coming back to it, and the landscape seems changed, and he's trying to maybe understand that or maybe not. Gate or no gate, sign or no sign, it had been good to be back, to be driving down through the estate and remembering the water, to be near it and to be thinking about fishing again, and about the clean black colour of the river with its peaty gold and the shadows, but rich and dark where it was deep. It had been reassuring, yes, it had, as though an easing somehow of all that had gone on in the time he'd been away, to be thinking instead only about where he might have had a try with his rod, the fly he might have used in weather that was grey but bright. For there had been also, when he'd arrived at that first gate, sign of recent rain. It had been warm and with a steady warm breeze, but rain had fallen in the night before or early that morning, and so the right weather exactly for fishing the river. Like this, Robbie, remember? As he'd always been told, that there'd be one particular fly good for this sort of day, or no, try this on another. To think in that way about temperature, the speed of the water. Of course he'd remembered. He got out of the car at the second gate and had scanned the sky again for weather. Now he thought it would be fine. The first gate hadn't been closed, despite the awful sign, "No vehicles beyond this point," had been printed in red letters on a white board and attached to a post, but the gate itself had been pulled back enough that he'd been able to drive through. This second one, though, he'd had to undo. There'd been a bit of a fuss with it, 2 bolts, but he managed to pull the thing open and fix it back again after him. And though he'd felt the wrench of having to do that, open and close a gate attached to a fence line that had never been there before, he'd decided by then he wouldn't let himself mind about it. He'd become that boy again, you see, thinking about the day, thinking about the beautiful fish, about the salmon lying there somewhere in a still pool, just resting as though waiting for him. So he'd driven on down the hill and onto the lovely flat where the river had always opened up so nicely, and had even seemed to hear it speaking to itself, as he had always thought when he was a boy that the river might do, in a language of its own. Here's everything you need. As though it was a companion, was how it had always felt, running alongside him, the murmuring sound of it reassuring him and making him feel confident and strong. And it had been true, hadn't it? That nothing else had seemed to matter to him then. So I think I'm going to finish there with my readings for the day, and to thank you, Gail, for your wonderful questions, and to thank this wonderful festival for inviting us to give our workshop this morning, and for me to read and introduce you to my collection of stories, Pretty Ugly, that's just come out. You're the first people to hear me read from this collection. But yeah, Gail, your questions, as always, were ace, gave me loads to think about. I'll finish here, and you could maybe say a few words about what we do together.
Well, I mean, Kirsty, I mean, it's always a pleasure introducing you, but always a pleasure reading your stories. And I love your short story collection, particularly those fragments that kind of rise off the page, to use your expression. They just come off the page. And this is such an interesting collection. So I'd urge everyone to go out and buy it and actually enjoy the collection and to be startled and challenged by it as well. But as Kirsty says, she and I work on Imagine Spaces, which is this essaying website. We use the idea of essays as verb rather than noun, because we were interested in the idea of making rather than simply having something beautifully already made and already thought out, much like her short stories in some ways, taking a leaf out of her short stories. The act of making is important to us, the act of thinking, the act of just pondering and reflecting on things rather than already have everything settled. So we've put together this little website, Imagine Spaces, is Imagine Spaces, all one word, .org. And we take particular essays that we're interested in. Anyone can submit to us. And if you'd like to be part of this particular venture, this particular trial and error, this kind of risk taking of sorts, do kind of drop me a line. Is imagespaces.gmail.com. So we'd look forward to hearing from you. But right now, just rush out and go and get a copy of Kirsty's new collection, Pretty Ugly, because it's such a riveting read. But thank you so much, Kirsty, for giving us your time. And thank you, the audience, for listening to us, although we can't quite see you. Okay. Kirsty, do you want to say parting words on Imagine Spaces as well?
No, just to say thank you. And you've described everything so eloquently and beautifully, Gail. But yes, as Gail says, we'd love to hear from you. And we like to think that Imagine Space is a kind of place where we can all gather and think further about writing and reading, and how exciting it is to think about making things up in words and putting them down on the page. So come along and be part of our adventure. We would just love it. Yes. Thank you again, Gail, for all of the questions and for everything.
Okay, thank you.